So for the purpose of this presentation, the competency that we're talking about is back squatting. All right, we're going to try and teach and develop skills that relate to back squatting. And the best way to do that is to have athletes actually perform back squats. But instead of just cutting them loose and letting them just run wild with the back squat and execute the skill in whatever manner they see fit, given that we've acknowledged that there is a dysfunction with how they are back squatting, we're going to want to try and use some coaching interventions in order to improve it. And I'll talk through 3 coaching interventions, or types of coaching interventions, that I think I would utilize when trying to train a back squat. Okay. The first sort of tool that I think we can use as coaches, or one of the tools that we can use as coaches, are constraints. This is a concept that I suppose has been popularized in recent times by the likes of Franz Bosch. And essentially what I'm talking about whenever I'm talking about constraints is I'm talking about changing the environment or something relating to the back squat in order to alter the way in which they are technically executing that lift. And with all of these tools here, I think there are pros and cons to using any of these sort of coaching methods. And with constraints, one of the pros that I think you have with taking a constraints-based approach is that you can, in a very short or almost immediate time frame, cause that athlete to change or alter the way they're executing the skill. One of the limitations that you potentially have with taking a constraints-based approach is that whenever you remove a given constraint, there's not necessarily a guarantee that that athlete will continue to execute the skill in the way in which you had hoped. Okay. Which leads us nicely on to our next kind of coaching tool or coaching method, and this is one that probably seems a little bit out there and isn't, readily talked about, I think, in the strength and conditioning world right now, but it's simply conversations. So we'll talk a lot about ways in which we can put constraints around athletes. We'll talk a lot about things like cueing athletes, which I'll get onto in a second. But I think a massive part of what we do as strength and conditioning coaches is have conversations with athletes either at the beginning of sessions or during sessions themselves. So whenever people are taking their 2, 3, 4 minute rest periods in between sets, the conversations that you have can shape the way in which the athlete actually performs the lift. Okay. And the good thing I think about having effective conversations with athletes is I think the pro of using that type of coaching intervention is if you pitch that conversation right, you can create a change in an athlete that is sustainable. Okay, by helping them understand why you're wanting them to execute a skill in a certain way, they can get to the root cause of what you're trying to actually achieve with them. Of course, one of the limitations with that is that conversations sometimes are difficult. And just because we say something doesn't mean that it's heard. Just because it's heard doesn't mean that it's understood. And just because the athlete understands it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to action it. Which leads us nicely on to our third way of intervening in order to train an athlete in a back squat. And that's going to relate to cueing an athlete. And when I talk about cueing, I'm talking about the verbal instructions that we can give an athlete when they are actually executing the rep itself, or a cue that we might deliver in between reps in order to try and cause an immediate change. Now, I'm not going to get into too much detail about the intricacies of internal cues or external cues, but I think it's worth just acknowledging that cues have somewhat of the same pros and cons as constraints. The pros are we can potentially cause an immediate change in how somebody's executing a skill by effectively cueing. And the cons are that if we're not around to actually deliver the cue, then there's a risk that the athlete will revert back to the poor technical execution or dysfunction that we have seen previously. That kind of covers then the main tools that I would consider fitting within the concept or the pillar of training a lift.